Hello everyone, my name is Ala Zagerman. I will talk about Ansera LLC Applied Sciences Production Laboratory. We're a biotech company located in Brantford, Connecticut, and our main focus is to supply a faster resolution to food and environmental pathogen testing. So our proprietary instrument Piper is the resolution for that. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. Currently, I'm a scientist 3 for the production laboratory in Ansera for applied sciences. Prior to that, I worked for 20 years for the state of Connecticut Department of Public Health Environmental Microbiology Laboratory. There, I was in charge of foodborne outbreak investigations, produce surveillance, NARMS retail food study, dairy testing, and water testing. So we had a lot of regulatory agencies that we have to be compliant with, including ISO 17025. Let me give you a little bit an overview of what you're going to hear today. Initially, I'm going to invite Zoe Moscato, who is our engineer, and she will describe to you what Piper is all about, which is our proprietary instrument. After that, I will come back and we'll talk about Applied Sciences Production Laboratory overview, ISO 17025 and the AOAC compliance in the laboratory, and benefits of Qualtrics workflows for laboratory compliance. So let's let Zoe come down and describe Piper, and I will be back after that.
Hello everyone, my name is Zoe Moscato. I'm one of the development engineers at Ansera, and I'm going to be bringing you through a brief overview of the Piper platform. So the Piper platform is made up of the following systems. There's the Piper instrument, consumable cartridges, imaging and detection algorithms, and our results reporting portal. Here you can see a schematic of the cartridge being inserted into Piper and the Piper outputting results to the user. So first, what is Piper? Piper is a benchtop instrument for the detection of foodborne pathogens, and it includes the following subsystems. There is a pneumatic pumping system. This propels samples from the cartridge input reservoirs to the imaging windows. While the sample is flowing through the cartridge, a magnetics PCB works in conjunction with magnetic ferrofluid that is added to the sample to quickly push up targets to the focal plane. With these targets in the focal plane, the digital microscope can scan the entire cartridge and acquire an image of each of the samples. After those images are acquired, the onboard computer can then process the data and send the results to the online portal called the intelligence engine. Here you can see what it looks like when the Piper door is open. The pneumatic pumps are located at the top. Those 4 pumps interface with 4 pumps on the cartridge, or 4 valves, and the magnetics PCB sits below the cartridge. When the door is closed inside the Piper, there's a cutout called the imaging window so that the microscope can scan the lanes. So at the start of a run, the user is prompted to load samples via pipette into the input reservoirs. You could see an example of what this looks like on the Piper screen would look like on the top right. So our consumable cartridges prevent pathogens from coming in direct contact with the Piper instrument. And this is great because it reduces the risk of cross-contamination and negates the need for instrument sterilization between samples. The cartridges, you can see on the left here, are composed of laser-cut plastic and adhesive layers that form microfluidic channels when they are pressed together, and each cartridge supports the testing of 12 unique samples per run. So when the targets are in position at the focal plane, the digital microscope scans all 12 windows of the cartridge and generates 1 image per sample. These images are then processed through our imaging algorithm, which can accurately detect the number of pathogens that are present. We use this value to derive the concentration of pathogens that are in your original sample, either per gram or per milliliter. Then the intelligence engine, or the IE, which is Ansera's online portal for results reporting, will output data for the customer to review. Depending on the assay or application, the IE provides valuable information to users ranging from animal health to the efficacy of antimicrobial procedures and more. So through this whole Piper platform, Ansera is able to provide more valuable information to the customer and do it in significantly less time than competitors. So with that, I'll hand it back to Ala for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you.
Let's move on to Ansera Applied Sciences Production Laboratory description. We are going for accreditation for ISO 17025, and our primary focus is to resemble a customer laboratory and determine any difficulties that our usual customer would encounter with the instrument. So first, I will talk about what the production laboratory is all about. Then I will talk about the compliance, and finally, Qualtrics implementation. Production laboratory has grown a bit over the past year and currently have a team of 6 people. I started to implement traceability factors in the laboratory by labeling equipment with unique identifiers and making sure that they are traceable to their certificates of analysis or calibration certificates. Before Qualtrics, I was having quite a difficult time because I had lots of different 3-ring binders in the laboratory to keep all the traceability and records. For example, I had a temperature book, I had a media quality control book, I had the control cultures book. So it was very difficult to keep track. Every time I would revise a form, I would have to make sure that everybody had the most recent version of that form and there was no prior version form circulating around. Total of forms, I had about 1,700 forms, and I had extreme difficulties keeping track of that. Also, as we kept hiring people in the laboratory, I was giving them different trainings. Every training had its own form and some tests. That was also very difficult to keep track of, so I was buried in paperwork, as you could see. So this would describe how I felt back in September when I started and literally buried myself with paperwork, trying to make sure that the structure of the laboratory is compliant and not to miss anything for ISO 17025 and AOAC. Fortunately, now we have workflows, documents in Qualtrics, tests and trainings in Qualtrics. So right after we went through training, administrator training back in June, I implemented the system right away and I began uploading documents to Qualtrics as soon as the training was complete. I had so many ideas of how to implement other forms, even as workflows or just uploading them and having them locked revision, the most recent revision, so no one would grab the wrong one. So let's take a look at the equipment temperature monitoring. Any production laboratory would need to monitor temperature of their devices like refrigerators, freezers, incubators, and water baths. So this resembles a form that I had prior to Qualtrics. As you can see, there's a lot of different traceability factors on the form, including the instructions of what to do and how to take temperature, the temperature range, serial numbers, identifiers, days of the week. All of that needed to be kept track of, including on the bottom of the form, which you can't see, is also the revision and who approved the revision and the fact that it's a controlled document. So once Qualtrics came to play, I designed a workflow, and this is an equipment temperature workflow where each analyst was able to walk around, whether with an iPad, because we have multiple rooms within Ansera for the production laboratory, and some of them are BSL2 and some are not. So because of that, for some of the rooms, the cleaner rooms, we have an iPad that they can bring in and out, but for BSL2, we have locked-in laptops on the bench where they can record temperatures using the same workflow. What is convenient is Qualtrics is host-based, so they can access Qualtrics anywhere from any point as long as there's a computer or an iPad. This workflow that I designed is very easy to use. I created smart restrictions for each room within Ansera Laboratory and then restricted that room to the particular equipment that is there. Also, each equipment I restricted to the thermometer identifiers that were related to that particular equipment and assigned. Having said that, when the analyst has a drop-down menu at the list field, they can only see the thermometers that are related to that particular equipment. Did it take a lot of work on the front end for me? Yes, it did. But I believe that it's much easier to keep track and much easier to not make a mistake when you have those smart restrictions where Qualtrics allows you to do within a workflow. Because of that, I'm also created I also created a second reader loop. So we have so many thermometers to read. It's approximately 50 thermometers that we have. I have always assigned second reader by the workflow initiator, so someone else can take a look and scroll through and see if any temperature was missing. If you go in the advanced search in Qualtrics field and pick that workflow for temperature equipment record, a list will come up, and each instance for each time of the day when the temperature is taken comes up as such with its own unique identifier. What helps with that if I click on an instance, I can immediately see all this information as it is in front of you. So if an auditor was tracing back a sample and wanted to see what equipment was used and was there traceability, this is a perfect example to pull up this type of record in front of the auditor and show them where the equipment was, what thermometers were assigned to it, and then furthermore, it's pulls traceable to each certificate of calibration for each thermometer, which is in alphabetical or numerical order in Qualtrics in a separate folder. And this also, if you click on each identifier, and there it is, certificate of calibration. What I like about the fact that I was able to upload certificate of calibration for each thermometer, I'm using the properties fields to describe when the thermometers got calibrated again. So I don't have a certificate for that because the thermometers were calibrated within house. Because of that, the correction factors were different. So I documented it in properties. As you can see on the bottom, the edit reason of the document, and basically documented that this is when it was done, so there is no gap in calibration records. So if the auditor were to pull this is how I would present calibration materials going all the way back to a sample that this equipment was used for. The next thing I wanted to talk about is tracking inventory that comes in, consumables, any consumable products in any laboratory, tips, pipettes, gloves, and then reagents that are used. So the process was so broken down and incomplete. Some items that we received, some items need a quality control process and some don't. So some items would come in with a packing slip, which we would upload to a Dropbox, but some did not. So for some reason, Amazon or other vendors don't really send a packing slip all the time, and those were the consumables that would fall through the cracks. So initially, before Qualtrics, what I've done is design a binder in alphabetical order for each consumable reagent that needed quality control with a form like that. As you can see, there's a lot of information that needed to be written down each time a new lot or shipment is received, and they would have to follow the instructions that I wrote on each form for a different reagent. So I designed a Qualtrics workflow that would include everything that I just described. This way, you can trace back by using this workflow as pulling it in a report or an advanced search, and this you can upload the certificate of analysis or packing slip, and then later on be able to retrieve it for the auditor. When I make the workflow, I always try to make all fields viewable at the close step. This way, when you pull up an instance, you can see what information was entered throughout each step of the workflow, and it's very helpful information, including viewing any certificates or packing slips that were uploaded. Just to give you a closer look, and this is what it looks like a little bit closer up. I know there's a lot of information on the slide, so for record retention purposes, this will not go away. All of these fields are searchable, so I can restrict the searches to a particular field and pull up any certificate that is necessary for the auditor. And this is the packing slip that was in a prior slide, arrowed, and this is how it would look like. So, and we'll describe when we got the item, how much we got, what did it go through a quality control process. The next workflow I want to talk about is monthly control cultures. So all consumable in an environmental food laboratory would require some kind of a quality control process. Each quality control process, we're using control cultures either by microbiologics or ATCC that are traceable back to the vendor, so we can make sure that there is a process that documents how these cultures are made, how many passes are done, and the auditor would like to see if the cultures were ever contaminated, and how do we use them on a daily basis. So this form originally I designed to describe the process. So as you can see, we don't have a lot of quality control cultures currently, but all of them were purchased and only had one pass. And each time we take them out of the freezer, we put the cultures on slants fresh and determine whether or not they're pure, and we do that on a monthly basis. So that way, in a refrigerator, you have a fresh control culture for anything that comes into the laboratory, and you don't have to defrost it every single time. Once Qualtrics came on board, I designed this workflow instead of the form to keep track of all the monthly quality control cultures, when they're done, who they're done by, how many slants were streaked, and of course I always assign a second reader just to make sure everything is done correctly. And again, I made all the fields viewable, so this is the information that pulls up at the end of each instance, which I can easily pull up for an auditor depending on what day and time the auditor would like to see it, depending on which sample at random he or she would pull. The next thing I wanted to implement was the employee training and competency. So for training, I had a whole bunch of binders. Each employee had a binder, and I designed these forms to document every training that they went through, which was challenging. Again, each form has, I don't know if you could see on the bottom, has a revision, the date it was approved. All of these are controlled documents. So once Qualtrics came on board, I turned these forms into a training and tests, assigned different documents to the test to be reviewed, like all the standard operating procedures. And this is an example of what my training looks like under my profile in Qualtrics. All the red X's means that they haven't been approved by my manager yet, but they were taken. I can also pull the tests and trainings in the advanced search, or I have designed a report that looks like that, so we could see when the training was taken and completed, and the test. On top of that, I have designed employee task authorization workflow. So prior to that, ISO 17025 requires you to authorize each task after employee becomes competent and able to perform independently. Because of that, I designed this workflow to document each training. And again, looking it up in the search, this is what it looks like. I had to cut out the column on the right, which would describe every single employee's name that pertains to each instance that I've done for task authorization. This is a task authorization report. Again, I made all the fields viewable. As you can see, I ran this task authorization for multiple tasks for this employee. I believe that's me. And I can authorize more than one task at a time as long as the employee is able to do it independent. Of course, the most important workflow to document is the non-conforming events, risk assessment, and corrective action. So what I've done is create a process that any incident that would happen, or opportunities for improvement, we would determine whether or not they were non-conforming events, but most of them would trigger a risk assessment workflow within that workflow. However, I also made sure that all these workflows can be initiated independent, depending on the cause. So here's an example of a risk assessment. I did have to make some alterations because we did receive risk assessment and non-conforming events from Qualtracs staff, and thank you so much. So I didn't have to start from scratch, but I did make some alterations, and here you can see there was a cartridge failure on the Piper. So running a risk assessment, there was no cause, they did not know what happened, could have been a power outage or anything like that, but it is documented this way. Again, made all fields viewable at the end, so it's easier to pull up. If necessary, a corrective action workflow is performed. Again, this is an example of another corrective action where there was some cross-contamination done in an assay, and determining the effectiveness of this corrective action, whether or not employees need more training in aseptic technique. And this would conclude my lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to email or ask Qualtracs staff to contact me. Thank you for listening today.